Amlatha Shema Lagashoth, Athal Dabari Hathor Hazath, Hachathobain Basapar Hazah, Layara Ath Hasham Hanachbad, Wahanara Hazah Ath Yao Alecha, Wahapala Yao Ath Machathacha. The Tetragrammaton. What is the correct pronunciation of God's proper name? So where did the Hebrew language and script come from? The conventional view is that Hebrew arose during the 11th century out of the family of Northwest Semitic languages, particularly Canaanite. This is wrong. According to Masha, our language has no precursor. It is the language God spoke when he created the world. It is the language he imparted to Adam. Hebrew also did not come from the Egyptian hieroglyphs or the so-called Proto-Sinaitic script. The 22 symbols of our script were actually the inspiration for many of the Egyptian hieroglyphs. The reason our script looks less developed than the hieroglyphs is because the Egyptians, quote, improved upon the design of our more primitive script and added hundreds more symbols of their own. This effectively made their language inaccessible to the average Egyptian. Only the priests and the most highly educated Egyptians could decipher the glyphs and read and write. We maintain that the ancient Egyptians modified the 22 symbols of our script and just changed their sound values. However, the original meanings of the symbols remained unchanged throughout history. Now let's go over the rules. According to the method described at the end of Part 1, the vowel letters in Hebrew are easily and immediately recognized as vowels in the text, whenever they are not the first letters of a word. The only exception to this rule is the letter A. All Hebrew words begin with a consonant except when this letter is the first letter of the word, in which case it is either a short A vowel before a consonant or a silent, toneless vowel placeholder before a vowel. It is also a toneless suffix in masculine words. The example given in the chart is the third-person masculine singular pronoun ho, which means he in English. The letter A is silent in this word because it is the masculine version of the third-person singular pronoun. The next letter, ha, is always a silent vowel placeholder unless it is the first letter of a word. This letter is the last letter in Masha's name, but the vowel heard at the end of Masha's name is the inherent A vowel of the letter Shah, and the ha is silent. Another example of this is when God changed Abram's name in Genesis 17:5. He changed his name, but not the way it is pronounced. The inclusion of the letter Ha in his new name only changed the meaning of Abram's name. When Abram bought a field in Canaan, he was going by his new name. This field is actually mentioned in a monumental Egyptian inscription of the 10th century BCE by the pharaoh known as Shishak. It is called the Field of Abram, not Abraham. Thus, the letter Ha is only an orthographic indicator within Hebrew words. The only time you ever actually hear it as an aspirated consonant is when it is the first letter of a word. The next letter Wa is always, without exception, the long O vowel when it is not the first letter of a word. The example given in the chart is the third-person singular pronoun Ho-ah, which means she in English. The vowel letter A is heard at the end because the word is the feminine version of the third-person singular pronoun. Ho means he, but Ho-ah means she. The two words are spelled exactly the same in Hebrew. It is their pronunciation that makes them different. In modern Hebrew, the words he and she are pronounced hu and he respectively, but we are purging these contracted u and e vowels from the dialect because they are not original. The fourth letter ya is always, without exception, the long a vowel when it is not the first letter of a word. The verb become is pronounced yahi in Masoretic Hebrew, but again we are deleting this e vowel from the dialect. The original pronunciation is simply ya-e. The initial ya is heard as the consonant. The letter ha in the middle is silent, and the final letter ya is the pure long a vowel. The fifth letter, ga, is always, without exception, the long I vowel when it is not the first letter of a word. Otherwise, it is that difficult to pronounce guttural we've talked about. The example shown in the chart is the noun salvation. The original and correct pronunciation of this word is not Yeshua. It is Yahshua, with pure vowel sounds. The pronunciation Yeshua has two degraded vowels, a short E and a long U. The E is a contraction of the A vowel, and the long U is a contraction of the long O vowel, and we are deleting both. Granted, we do not have audio recordings of ancient Hebrew being spoken, so how can we be sure that the vowel assignment in this chart is accurate? Insights are gained by looking at how ancient Hebrew was transcribed in Egyptian and Akkadian. The ancient nations heard our forefathers speak Hebrew and they recorded some of the words that they heard. So the vowel assignment shown in this chart is based on this evidence. God's proper name was also recorded phonetically in Egyptian and Akkadian, and we'll be looking at these carefully as well. Once you understand how easy the system I just outlined is, you can look at this text and not be confused. Everything you need in order to read this text, which is Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 in the ancient script, is right in front of your eyes. No need for vowel points or diacritic signs of any kind. No need for a rabbi or a cantor or a chazan to teach you. Anyone can read this text flawlessly, even if they have no idea what they are saying. They only have to know the individual sounds that the letters make and the simple rules for the 5 vowel letters already discussed. For comparison, let's pull up the pointed Masoretic Hebrew version of this text and let's hear how it is read in the Tiberian dialect. After this, I will read it in the ancient dialect and script so we can hear the difference between the two.
Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz.
Barasheth bar alaim ath hashamayim wa'ath haaretz.
Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz.
Barasheth bar alaim ath hashamayim wa'ath haaretz. The differences might seem small at first, but they are actually huge. If I were to keep reading Genesis and not just this one verse, it will begin to sound like I'm speaking a different language than the Tiberian Hebrew you just heard. Related but very different. This is because, as I said, Tiberian Hebrew is a Canaanite dialect, and this is one of the ways our forefathers could tell if someone was Canaanite or not. We were both people of color, so you could not tell us apart by our looks, but you could immediately tell us apart when we began to speak. In the Tiberian Hebrew, you heard the consonant wa pronounced as v, when there is no v in ancient Hebrew. You also heard the word God pronounced as Elohim. The Canaanite word for God is El. The Hebrew words for God are Al, Alo, and Allahim, all of which were the precursors of the Arabic word for God, which is Allah. This particular word from Genesis 1:1 is pronounced Allahim, not Elohim. There is no long O vowel in this word, and the letter Ha is silent unless it is the first letter of a word. And in this verse, the word is the definite article Ha, the, Ha-aratz, the earth, and Ha-shamayim, the heaven. If you also notice, the short E vowel and the long E vowel dominates the Tiberian dialect. Bereshit, Elohim, Et, Shamayim, Eretz. This is signature Canaanite, and this vowel needs to be thoroughly purged from our dialect of Hebrew. All languages will undergo change over time unless there is a system in place that fixes the pronunciation of words for future generations. The Masoretes of Tiberias devised their vowel pointing system in the 9th century CE, and as a result, the snapshot they took of Canaanite unknowingly has not undergone any significant changes since then. But for the many centuries that Hebrew was written in the ancient script without any diacritic signs, the system we just described is really the only logical way the native sounds of the language could have been preserved in written form and passed on generation to generation. So now let's back up the vowel assignment in the previous chart. The letter Ga is both a guttural and also a vowel, but let's first look at the evidence that it's a guttural when it's the initial letter of a word. Hebrew is actually a misnomer. It is spelled in Hebrew with the letter Ga as the first letter. Tiberian Hebrew, which chooses to follow the Canaanite, treats this letter as a long E vowel in its name, turns the letter Ba into V, and makes the final letter another long E vowel. The result is Ivri, and this is clearly wrong. The word appears phonetically in Akkadian as Chapiri, and the Akkadians also use the Sumerian logogram Sag Gaz to write Chabiru. These writing systems do not have the pharyngeal fricative consonant, so they use the guttural letter Cha as a substitute. However, the Egyptians did have this sound, so when they wrote the name, they used the forearm hieroglyph for the first consonant. You will see this normalized as Apiru in English, because English does not have this letter or its equivalent sound. But what it sounded like when native Egyptians pronounced it was more like Gapiru. The long vowel at the end of the Akkadian and the Egyptian forms is how this word was pluralized in these languages. Thus, the name of the man who left the Tower of Babel still speaking the one language was not Eber or Heber. His actual name was Gahbar, and his descendants who continued to speak this language were called Gabarim, plural. Abram was called Gabare, singular, in Genesis 14 and 13. The next piece of evidence is how the Assyrians transcribed the name of the Hebrew king commonly known as Omri. Here they consistently wrote Chumrae in Akkadian. This tells us the initial Ga in this name was the guttural consonant and not the vowel marker. The letter Ya in the final position marks the long A vowel. Akkadian uses A for this sound. It is not an E vowel as in the version Omri. The correct way to say the king's name is Gomre. When the Assyrians heard the name of the Hebrew king known as Hoshea, they wrote Ausai in Akkadian. This tells us the initial ha in this name was almost silent because of the stress on the long O vowel in the opening syllable. A long I vowel was heard at the end of the name. Akkadian script uses the diphthong AU contracted to long O and II for these two sounds. The king's name is pronounced Ho-Shai, not Hoshea or Hawashai. Ho-Shai. This evidence proves the letter Wa is a long O vowel when it's not the first letter of a Hebrew word. It also proves the letter Ga is a long I vowel when it is not the first letter of a Hebrew word. Finally, let's look at the name of King David, since there are some claiming incorrectly that there are no vowels written in the ancient Hebrew. The king's name is spelled in the Bible 788 times with the letters Da, Wa, Da, and 288 times with the letters Da, Wa, Ya, Da. It is not logical to assume the letter Ya in the full form of the king's name is a consonant, because this would mean there were two drastically different ways to say the king's name, so it must be a vowel letter. The king's name is not David as it appears in the Greek New Testament. It is not David. It is not Dawid. His name is pronounced Do'ed, or Dode for short. The king's name is derived from the Hebrew word Dode, which means beloved. More correct versions of the full form in Greek are Dawid and Daw'ed, both of which preserve the vowel cluster between the first and last consonants in the king's name. Barasheth bar al-la'im ath ha-shemaim wa ath ha'aratz. Wa ha'aratz he tha, tha'o wa ba'o, wa chashach gal panei tha'om. Wa roch al-la'im marachapath gal panei hamem. Wa yamar al-la'im ya'e or, wa ya'e or. Wa yar al-la'im ath ha'or chetob. Wa yabdal al-la'im bein ha'or wa bein ha'chashach. Wa yikar al-la'im la'or yom, wa la'chashach kar leila. Wa ya'e garb, wa ya'e bakar, yom achad. Wayamar Masha al ha'ala'im, Hana, Anache ba al b'nei Yeroshua, wa amati laham, ala'e abathecham, shalachni alecham, wa amarole, ma shamo, ma amar alham. And Masha said to God, Behold, I come to the children of Yahusharal, and shall say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they will say to me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? Exodus 3:13. It's a strange question for Masha to be asking God during his first encounter with God. The first question was, why me? Why are you sending me? The second question is this one. What is your name? Of course, Masha already knows his name, but he only overheard it from his forefathers. He now wants to hear it from God himself. How does God say his own name? The pronunciation of God's proper name has to be Yah-O, according to an unambiguous and consistently applied vowel system where consonants that act as vowel letters only do so when they are not the first letter of a Hebrew word, with the sole exception of the letter Ah. The only consonant heard in God's name is the first letter Yah. The second letter Ha is silent. It assumes the sound of the previous vowel and closes the first syllable. The third letter, Wa, is the long O vowel. Like the second letter, the fourth letter is also silent. It assumes the sound of the previous vowel and closes the terminal syllable. God's proper name is therefore pronounced Yah, pause, O, full stop, Yah-O. Any vowel system other than what we have outlined would not be in an unambiguous system. It would entail the creation of ad hoc rules that are not self-evident in a consonantal text that uses no diacritic signs of any kind to assist with pronunciation. So in my initial defense, yes, the simplistic vowel system we have described with no vowels that arise from the contraction of pure vowel sounds, ah, a, o, and I, is proof in itself that God's name is pronounced Yah-O and there is no other viable alternative. Wayamar ala'im al-Masha, a'e ashar a'e, Wayamar, Chathamar labane Yahusharal, a'e shalachne alecham. And God said to Masha, I will be who I will be. This shall you say to the children of Yahusharal, I will be has sent me to you. Wayamar god ala'im al-Masha, Chathamar al-bane Yahusharal, Ya'o, Ala'e abathechem, Aula Abram, Aula Yotzachak, wa Aula Yaugakab, Shalachni Alicham, Zashmo Lagalam, was Azachare Ladar Dar. And God said more to Moshe, this is what you shall say to the children of Yahusharal. Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abram, the God of Yotzachak, the God of Yaugakab, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial to all generations. Exodus 3:14 and 15. The first response from God was not really an answer to Moshe's question. God begins by telling Moshe who he is. I will be who I will be, which is A'eh Ashar A'eh in Hebrew, is not his personal name. I will be describes who he is. It is a definitive way of saying my deeds define my name and they are far beyond your ability to comprehend. I disagree with those saying I will be is some sort of esoteric statement about God existing. God does not try to explain or prove his existence. He does not care if you deny his existence. What he does care about is his name. And the second reply to Moshe is where God utters his own name for the first time since he created man. But the point I want to get across before we go any further is that we cannot define the meaning of God's name. We can learn how to pronounce it, and he wants his people to do so. But the definition of his name would not fit inside a trillion encyclopedias. So those claiming his name means he exists, they are mistaken. The tetragrammaton may only be 4 letters, but its definition cannot be expressed with even an infinite number of letters. It is the primary word of the Hebrew language. It is the most important word in any language. It is the most important word in the universe. So in this video, we do not presume to know the definition or meaning of God's name, nor will we get into etymology, which is a waste of time. We are only concerned with how to pronounce God's name because he revealed that to Moshe, and therefore we can know it. He did not reveal the meaning of his name except to say, I will be who I will be. Wadabar Alaim al-Mashah, Wayamar Aleo, Ane Ya'o, Wa'ar al-Bram, al-Yotzachak, Wa'al Yogaka, Wa'al Shadeh, Washame Ya'o, La Nodaithe Laham. And God spoke to Moshe and said to him, I am Yahweh, and I appeared to Abram, to Yahutzachak, and to Yaugakab, as God Almighty. But by my name Yahweh was I not known to them. Exodus 6:2 and 3. If you read the book of Genesis, you will find that the patriarchs know what God's personal name is, and they call him by his name. But what we should not find, according to Exodus 6:2 and 3, is God making himself known to them by his name, or rather introducing himself to them by his personal name. Exodus 6:2 and 3 does not contradict Genesis 13 and 4. The patriarchs knew God's name, but God never uttered his name to them, and they did not hear him say his name. When God spoke to Moshe, it was the first time since Adam that God declared his personal name out loud to any human being. So how did Abram know God's name if God never told him? He knew it because Adam and his wife, the first man and the first woman made in God's image, passed this knowledge down to their descendants by word of mouth. Adam's wife is the first person to say God's name in the Bible, according to Genesis 4 and 1. Each generation repeated God's name to the next generation, just as Adam pronounced it in the first generation. Abram heard God's name pronounced by his parents and by his grandparents, but he never heard God say his own name. Now I know what those of you well versed in the scripture are thinking right now. This brother is wrong, and he needs to look up Genesis 15 and 7 and Genesis 28 and 13, where God does pronounce his name to Abram and his grandson. I'm going to address these two passages in more detail later in the video, because they bring up a much larger issue about the Masoretic Hebrew text that underlies all English translations of the Bible. Let me just say here that the Hebrew manuscripts that predate the Masoretic text did not have God's name appearing in these two verses, and I'm going to prove that during the course of this video.